Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Good to see you.
Great. Great. Good to see you. This is Simple Politics for our people who are watching. I'm Kim Wehle, and my guest is Dr. Justin Garcia. So excited. Professor, research professor, expert in sex, reproduction, and gender at the University of Indiana, and also executive director of the Kinsey Institute, which some of us kind of light up a bit when we hear. Could you please, first of all, thank you so much for coming tonight. I was telling our viewers how excited I was to have you. But can you please tell us who was Alfred Kinsey and why is that name so important in your field of expertise, that is sex and gender and reproduction and all of that?
Oh, sure. And thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here with you. And I adore your work, and it's really wonderful to be here. So the Kinsey Institute's at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. So we're about an hour south of Indianapolis. And the Institute was founded here. Next year will be our 75th anniversary. So the Institute is the leading sexological research institute in the world. And we have 16 faculty. We have working on in 9 different laboratories on different questions of sexual and gender diversity. And we also have the collections, and the collections have over 500,000 items. It's the largest research collection of erotic and sexual materials in the world, really documenting the diversity of the human experience and people's romantic lives, their sexual lives, their identities. And Dr. Kinsey himself was a zoologist. He was a biologist. He was on the zoology faculty at IU. And he, later in his career, he taught a marriage course. And some people know the movie with Liam Neeson. And he started teaching this marriage course. And he shifted his interests. He actually studied gall wasps. He worked in the field of entomology. And he went from documenting the variety of gall wasps to documenting the variety of people's sexual lives. It was the same almost obsessive methodology that really trying to carefully understand the variation. And he was an evolutionary biologist, as I am too. I was the next biologist since Kinsey himself at the Institute, and it really was about understanding the diversity of traits, something he was interested in, and influenced things like understanding the Kinsey scale, thinking of sexual orientation as a continuous trait from 0 to 6. Things that researchers and the public still use today. And we try and honor that legacy and continue to study issues of human sexuality, relationships, well-being today, but also to expand it. A lot has changed in 3/4 of a century about our identities.
Right, in 1947. So this is a man who created that scale, as you mentioned, heterosexual on one end, homosexual, and we're still having that discussion every day. Things are shifting so quickly, and I really am so happy to have you on to talk about the science behind it, because I think both for young people and for older generations, sometimes it's hard to understand the generational language around this and kind of updating thoughts. So I want to go back and to your interview for, I think it was HBO, in a show called Swiped, fascinating documentary about the effects of online dating and social media on the human experience around relationships. And they clip you. I mean, I've been on those shows too. They let you talk for 2 seconds. So that's why I want to dive a little bit deeper.
Sure.
But you took us back to what you called social monogamy 4.4 million years ago. Can you explain what that is? And also your 2 big shifts since then in how we think about sexual relationships and romantic relationships.
Sure, I love it. Oh my God, you're a good note taker, Kim. And, so there are 2 areas. So start with the first piece in that. When we think about, by training, I'm an evolutionary biologist and anthropologist. So I try and think about our sexual and gender diversity and our romantic and sexual lives in the context of human evolution, of sort of how did we get here? What are the factors that have shaped who we are in this current experience? And their relationship to our biology, our physiology, and how organisms are always responding to their environment, right? Biology is not static. It's always, it's sort of biology and culture work hand in hand always and have throughout human history. So the part that you brought up about 4.4 million years ago is when we saw the rise of social monogamy and humans. My colleague Helen Fisher did a lot of this classic work, and our anthropologist, who's also on an affiliate of the Kinsey Institute. And for those that are interested in human evolution, that's between the sort of Ardipithecus and Lucy, right? A little over 4 million years ago. And what we saw was the rise of intense pair bonding. And when biologists talk about monogamy, the term itself doesn't really mean anything to us, because there's two types of monogamy. There's social monogamy, which is pair bonds, which is intense relationships. And then there's sexual monogamy, which is sexual exclusivity. Now, for biologists, those are two different things. They're different phenomena. They have different mechanisms. Often, social monogamy, forming an intense relationship, a pair bond, we try and impose sexual monogamy on a mate, whether you're a human or you're a cardinal bird outside or you're any number of other organisms. But they're often distinct. They're not totally the same thing. And but social monogamy defines sort of pair bonding and forming intense relationships, characterized by mutual territory defense, mutual raising of offspring, and what we might even call kind of romantic, passionate love in humans, right? Those intense bonds. It's not overwhelmingly popular in the natural world, so only about 3% of mammals engage in pair bonds, but 15% of primates, our closest relatives. But birds are the opposite. 90% of birds will engage in pair bonding, at least for a breeding season. So humans have all these traits that suggest that we do this. We have a lot of biological traits, behavioral adaptations that suggest that we engage in these intense bonds. But we also know that people all over the world sometimes struggle with the sexual exclusivity part, the sexual monogamy part. So we form these intense bonds, but often our sort of our love sense and our sex sense are in conflict. I personally believe that explains a lot of the ups and downs of our romantic relationships, both today and over the millennia.
So you're suggesting that if we didn't impose that sexual monogamy on the bonding, social monogamy, that's a sort of a false pairing, or it's not consistent with our necessarily evolutionary biology, maybe we wouldn't have such a hard time in with monogamy.
Oh, oh my God, you're right at the core of it. That's such a good question. And I'm always careful to say that. I think that they're all part of the evolutionary story. I think forming those intense pair bonds, the social monogamy, is a part of the human evolutionary story. Now, there's plenty of people who don't do that. In one of our own big national studies, we found that 1 in 5 people at some point have been consensually non-monogamous. So they've been in an open relationship, separate from infidelity. There's about 1 in 5 people at some point have opened their relationship. Often this looks like it was happening in younger people, kind of open relationships, or they experimented with either swinging or not being exclusive, or they were polyamorous. So there is a lot of diversity. But we see that there's this global pattern, on average, of forming these intense bonds. And for some people with more than one, but usually one person at a time. Now, I don't think sexual exclusivity is totally culturally imposed. That is a popular argument. I don't think the data bears it out. What we see is that people do all over the world when they form these relationships, just like in other animals, they try and impose it. So I'll use the example of these red-winged blackbirds I saw in the nature preserve ones. And there was clearly a mating pair of a male and a female. And when the one male left, they were pair bonded. They had a nest. They were building a nest together. The female mated with another male because there was probably an evolutionary advantage for her. Her offspring could have more genetic diversity. And one male raises, another sires them. Maybe the next season, or the previous season, she was with that primary male. But when he came back, he saw that she was trying to mate with someone else, and he fought the other male, and they went down into the reeds, and he drowned the other male in the water. Birds can be pretty aggressive in mating, just like all other animals. So I think to your question is that culturally imposed? Well, birds do it, humans do it, we all do it. If we try and impose exclusivity, we mate guard in the context of forming those relationships, and sometimes do pretty terrible things in the context of mate guarding. But I don't think that we can. I don't think that people have, particularly a number of sexologists over the years have suggested, well, what if we just got rid of these notions, these culturally imposed notions of monogamy? It's built into the human brain, things like jealousy, things like sense of proprietariness, things like Part of romantic love psychologically is obsessive thinking, intrusive thought. You want to be just with that person. You don't want them with someone else. It takes a lot of work for people who try to be polyamorous or open their relationships. Doesn't mean it doesn't work. It works beautifully for. It's not something that's, I think it's just as much work to be non-monogamous as it is to be monogamous, whichever rule set you subscribe to.
So I want to get back to some other bifurcated ways that we think about these things, particularly around gender and sexual identity and sex. But before we get there, could you walk us through the two major shifts that you've seen since 4.4 million years ago? My understanding, one was the agricultural revolution, and the second is the digital age that we're living through right now. And how is it that in your research and your expertise, those are such big changes from that first social pair bonding / sexual monogamy that happened 4.4 million years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, great. And I just want to say hi to some of the folks joining us, and some folks I know, Hunt and Jinju and Lexi and Jen. Thanks all of everyone for joining us. I think that since that period, 4.4 million years ago, where we saw the rise of social monogamy, and there's all sorts of adaptations that suggest that part of what happened was humans descended from the trees, our ancestors descended from the trees, and then we started to see all sorts of different biological and behavioral patterns, including holding offspring, being more bipedal, just in sort of engaging in different types of social behaviors, different physiological adaptations. So since that, the agricultural revolution, then there was this huge period of understanding human evolution, responding to environments, and the agricultural revolution, or the sort of shift from the Paleolithic era, we started to see more sedentary lifestyles. So not as much moving around. So populations would find areas, they would work in the land. Trade started to happen a little bit differently. And then relationships also took different forms, and the degree to which things like marriages were occurring between different places because land had new value. So relationships began to become regulated in new ways with the agricultural revolution. And in terms of a timestamp, we're talking about 10 to 15,000 years ago. And there were more cultural and legal regulations around relationships. I mean, marriage to me, as a biologist, I think about pair bonding and being in love, and marriage is the sort of legal contract that sits atop of that biology. And in the best cases, it aligns. You're marrying someone you have intense feelings for, but not always. And it's not necessarily good or bad. I think that they have different agendas, a sort of marital contract and the physiology of pair bonding of different bottom lines. So we saw that with the agricultural revolution. And the argument I made in that documentary you're referring to with Nancy Jo Sauls was that I think the next big moment was the rise of the internet. I really think that the internet gave us these unlimited opportunities, these possibilities, but they don't always pan out. And sometimes they give us a false sense of what is actually possible. But I think that changed courtship. I think the two biggest changes to courtship process was the agricultural revolution, and then the rise of technology that allowed us to connect with people in every corner of the world.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we started the show, and how when I was in college, you sort of have a crush on someone, go party to party, bar to bar, try to find them, maybe call them if you get a phone number. And then tended to maybe have one crush at a time.
Yeah.
And now on dating apps, as you indicate, it's not one or two people, it's thousands that you have exposure to all the time. I mean, at any given moment, and many people will have multiple potential mates going on without others being aware that there are multiple people. So how does that, I mean, it seems like it's happened so rapidly, Justin, just so fast. How is that aligning or not aligning with our instincts and our evolutionary biology? Where are the first, before we get to the benefits, which I think everybody wants to kind of understand so that we can feel good about this, but let's talk about the glitches, how this is tough for some people, or it's not necessarily sitting with how our brains are developed to engage in these kinds of romantic courtships.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. So we have brains that the human brain evolved in the context of smaller groups, and part of what we're getting in this information age, in the context of courtship, is too much. It's too much data for us to process. I often joke that when I go, there's a particular restaurant I like to go to, and when I go, the menu is so large, and I know there's a particular salad that I like, and I get the salad. And every time I go, I'm going to get something else. I'm going to try something. But the menu is so large. And after flipping the pages for 10 minutes, I've gotten the same salad for the last 10 years because I can't process all the options. And it's what we call cognitive overload, or sometimes called the paradox of choice, is that there's so many options, we struggle with really choosing one. And part of what's going on with new technologies for many of us is that there is this sense of an unlimited resource, that we have all of these options that we can go to. Now, that presents two distinct problems when we think that there's an unlimited resource. And one is that we have a hard time investing with what we're in. And I think this is partly what you were talking about. So you meet someone and you have a hard time saying, hey, I really like you. I want to invest in you. Because you go, well, there's 1,000 other people on that app. I have to keep looking. So we know, as relationship scientists, we know that that's really problematic for relationships, because a relationship cannot build and thrive if both parties don't invest in it. One of my great colleagues used to always say, you need more than 1.5 people in a relationship. You can't have one person and someone else partly engaged with it. And that can be a real problem, particularly in this age where we always have a sense of, you can go to lunch with someone and say, well, everything was fine, but I don't know, she put a lemon in her iced tea, and maybe I should get back on the app and find someone
Yeah,
else.
it's a little FOMO that there's someone better, or someone told, similar to what you said, it takes two to say yes and one really to say no in a relationship.
Yeah.
It's not always two to tango.
Exactly.
So that's so interesting. So overwhelm, huge menu.
Yeah.
It's like one of those like those buffets that, okay,
Yeah.
I'm just going to get an omelet because I don't even know what to do.
Exactly.
But it seems like there's some other things. And there was another expert on the show that had sort of was talking about the kinds of things our brains look for in a mate, and that prior to I'm interested in your thoughts on this, prior to the digital age, there was always going to be some physical attraction, unless, as you indicate, there's some sort of social construct or legal construct of marriage that puts people together for other reasons. But if we're just organically going to sort of pair up marriage with sexual attraction or physical attraction, but it could also be, personality, intellect, education, family, all these other things. And this other person that was interviewed said, listen, now it's disproportionately physical, and it's not even physical in the sort of sensing of a human and even the smell and sort of seeing them physically and having that energy. It's a photo. And it's swipe right, swipe left, super swipe. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How are our brains wired to choose a mate, and what's happening with social media right now in that regard?
Yeah, and I think this is so interesting, because when we look at apps and websites and the ability of technology for people to connect in a really revolutionary way, in an evolutionary, unprecedented way, there is this opportunity that you could find out, if you want to find someone who can play tennis with you, you can go on and find someone to play tennis with you. That's always what I'm looking for. Or you can look for someone who maybe has the same particular sexual fetish as you, or someone who has the same interest in music and theater as you. That really is a remarkable ability to find someone using these new technologies in ways that are unprecedented. Or maybe you're gay and lesbian in a community that it's not really safe for you to go into your local bar and try and pick someone up. You can use these technologies to look for people who are also gay or lesbian. And in fact, we know from our studies, our Singles in America study we do with Matt, that gay and lesbian people are twice as likely to use the online apps and websites in many parts of the country. So there's sort of that wonderful opportunity portion. But the other is exactly right, that we've evolved. Courtship has also evolved to involve all of the bodily senses. We want to see someone's body language. We want to smell their pheromones and their and their body, indicators of health. We want to feel them and engage in tactile encounters. Maybe that's shaking a hand or a hug or touching their arm as we talk. You want to hear their voice. Turns out their voice has been studied in mate choice and is important. Look at their skin tone. Look at their symmetry. All of these bodily senses are getting invoked. Even taste them in some case, right? And in these technologies, we lose some of that. Now, what's really interesting is over the last few years, some of the apps are realizing that. So now, rather than just still photos, you can put a short video in, like a 3-second video. The idea that you can get a little voice, you can get a little bit of body language. And you can get a sense. I mean, I think even today in the COVID age of looking at video dating has gotten really popular. And a lot of the apps now have an option to video date. You get more sensory information. You can see their artwork, you hear their voice, you see their body language, get a sense of whether they're funny, if they're, so we know that is important in the courtship process. You're right. What can happen with the apps is you're focusing on just one piece, just the physical, just the photo. What we've seen, interestingly, and particularly what we're seeing after COVID in this last year, is that people seem to be doing it a little bit more thoughtfully. So they are reading more of the profile. So they're trying to pull information. So if I can't smell you or hear you to know how healthy you are, well, then maybe I'm looking for photos where I can get a sense of your teeth or your hair and how you look. Do you look disheveled? Do you look healthy or hygienic? So the brain is still trying to get that information, but it's trying to pull it out of other available data in the still photos. So we know some of those photos are more successful than others for that reason.
Yeah, so I'm also interested in your thoughts on the development of these sites. And, you know, there's a lot of biases or sorting that happens with writing any kind of program, computer program. And some argue that, listen, this was Silicon Valley, this was primarily white males, and biologically males are maybe sort of approach these issues differently than females and other genders. Do you see that as also a factor here? And is that going to shift, do you think? That is, okay, a man wrote this program. This is about however men choose a mate versus how another gender would choose a mate.
Yeah, I think that there is an argument there. My sense from, I've worked with some of these companies over a decade. My sense is that some of them are trying to find ways to be, they're always trying to be better. In part, not always because they're, you know, these organizations that want to change the world in these positive ways. They have a financial bottom line, and they recognize that half their clientele are women. So, I mean, I think there is a commitment to being approachable and accessible to different kinds of populations, but they also want to be useful to these different populations because those are their clients. So, I think when we look at the last decade of what some of these companies have done, there have been a lot that have failed, right? So we know that there have been companies that have used pheromone studies, that have used where you do cheek swabs and genetic analyses. And I think what some of them end up doing is they're a little bit premature in terms of the science. Like in my earlier life, I used to do behavioral neurogenetics work. I used to work on a suite of genes in the dopamine system, in the serotonin system. And you know, I don't think the data is really there to start matching people based on genotype and their genetics. It's a cool idea, but the scientific research, the studies, that it's really not clear exactly how what we call a sortative mate genetically. So then to have a product that you're delivering to people is a little bit questionable, I think, from a scientific perspective. But people have tried these different approaches. A lot of people still really like matchmaking. So I think the other thing we've seen in the last year is a boom in the matchmaking industry, where you go to someone, you pay. It often can be quite expensive. It's not necessarily for everyone. It's in some ways socioeconomically classed, and matchmakers can cost anything from I know some of them. You could spend $1,000 or $100,000, and I mean, so there's a huge variation in terms of. But partly, usually, what you're doing is you're paying someone to help you with the screening process, or sometimes you're paying to be in a particular socioeconomic class with other people who can also afford the $50,000 matchmaker.
Right. So what about, I know you do advise
Mhm.
Match.com. I'm curious, and given what you said was your prior research, what happens to the brain in terms of dopamine with when you have that, it's a match, and the rejections? Because it also, and this goes beyond, I would say, probably just matchmaking. This is our teenagers on their phones, on Snapchat and Instagram.
Mhm.
And I mean, my sense of it is that, when I was a kid, there was one face-to-face persona. Maybe there was somebody on the phone that you had to learn how to talk on the phone. But now there are multiple sort of identities that you have to curate and care about on various platforms as well as face-to-face. And I'm curious about what does that do? Is there any research around what swipes and likes and all of that and ghosting and rejection, all of that immediate, multiple, all day long type of responses is doing to our brains?
Yeah. There have been different debates on this, and they're always really exciting because there's a lot of different moving pieces on the neurobiological side and also on the behavioral side. So we know that when people start to get attracted or fall in love, there's a little pea-sized part of the brain, the ventral tegmental area, that produces dopamine. And actually, my colleague I mentioned earlier, Helen Fisher with Lucy Brown, put people on an fMRI brain scanner to look at when they were falling in love. And people who were romantically in love, that part kind of glows in an fMRI. And an fMRI measures oxygenated blood flow. So the idea that that part of the brain was working more. And that's the dopamine powerhouse. So that when you see images of your beloved, you get, and dopamine is the pleasure hormone in some ways. You get that sense, that euphoric sense from just seeing an image of the person. And many of us know that, right? When you're in love and you hear someone's voice on the phone, or you talk to them, or even in a crush, if you have that crush, you can kind of just feel this sense of calm and excitement and all at once. So that's partly happening in our brain. So we know that when we look at technologies, in some ways it depends on how we're using them. Are you using technology to look at pictures of someone and to read about them? And that can be so pleasurable to reconnect. Do you have, is your picture on your phone a picture with you and your kid, or you and your partner, or your multiple partners, or your those can remind us of happy experiences. And I think that there's a lot of positive mental health outcomes that can come from having those images or those video clips that we can look back on. If you're not ruminating, I think it's a different issue if you're checking them 10 times a day, and that can it can obstruct life, not totally unlike, people with an alcohol or drug problem can obstruct their life. You can be almost addicted to social relationships or love and sex in that sense. I'm cautious not to use the term sex addiction. It's a wildly controversial diagnosis among sexologists. But you can have these sort of compulsive drives. But the other side of that is when you tear that apart, tear that away. So those same colleagues put people who in the fMRI who had been romantically rejected. And what they found was that the same part of their brains went off as when they were in love. But then all these other regions also went off that were remarkably like someone going through cocaine withdrawal. And so when you tear love bonds apart, and in many ways, love is more intense than sex. People do much wilder stuff for love than they do for sex. We kind of like to joke about people, do wild things for sexual behavior or intercourse or interactions. But when we look, particularly when we look at sort of legal documents or we look at court cases, when people feel rejected in love, we know that they do much more intense things, often much more dangerous things, more violent things. With some studies, men are a little bit more likely to attempt suicide after rejection. People, or both men and women, will engage in sometimes intimate partner stalking after romantic rejection. People abuse alcohol and other drugs. They can have clinical depression. Some people go and have sex with 3 people the following weekend. Some don't want to talk to a potential partner for 3 years afterwards. So we know that love, when it's pulled away from us, and I think that's in part, exactly as you were saying, what's going on with the sort of brain. It's that that can be really hard. And I have a pet theory that I've been playing with in my next book project, The Intimate Animal, that I think partly what's going on is that we often don't grieve intimate rejection. And when someone has a major loss, if a parent dies, a child dies, a best friend dies, we grieve them. It's okay to have a picture on the mantle. It's okay to talk about them. It's okay. And then we go through a process of sort of moving on from that. when we end really intense relationships, particularly abruptly, whether through a death, whether through a breakup, whether through an affair, often we don't grieve them. And people, your friends will tell you, oh, just delete them, never talk to them.
Absolutely.
I'm not convinced that's actually that healthy for us. We need to go through the loss. You do have to talk about it for a few weeks or months. You do have to process the grief of ending a relationship, because it's so intense. The same thing that gave us those intense experiences when we looked at the picture give us this intense sense of bereavement when they're gone.
So is there more of that with sort of the, you start something online and all of a sudden they stop responding, or you go on a couple dates and all of a sudden they stop responding, versus smaller groups? Maybe you've got, it's harder to meet people, as you indicate. You don't have thousands and thousands of options. Are people experiencing both the euphoria and the rejection, or maybe there's no research on that yet? I'm just curious.
Yeah. It's unclear. I think that, there's two parts. I think one is in the long term, yes, in the long term couples, if you have people that start to feel like they're disconnecting, and that can often be the sign of a relationship in crisis, that can be really hard. And that's a time that you might say go to a couples therapist, or when you can start to feel the relationship drifting away. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean a relationship is over. There's all sorts of times that you need a readjustment or an assessment, or you start to drift away, but you can often find ways to drift back together and figure out what's going on. Sometimes it's a sign to leave. What you brought up, I think, is really important for people who are dating, for singles, for the over 100 million Americans who are single at any given time, people moving over a third of the adult population, moving in and out of relationships, is that it can be so frustrating. It can be so demoralizing. Suddenly you're talking to someone, you think it went great, and they went away. I think it goes back to what we were talking about, the paradox of choice. It's the other side of it, is that people feel like there are these options, and people can be pretty rude in today's dating market. There's not the accountability. My family doesn't know your family. We're not going to see each other at the market every week. We're not going to, the accountability is different when there's someone that you're not necessarily connected to as much, when you have a sense of so many other options. And I think that makes people do kind of rude things that can be really hurtful, even if it happens to them. And many people feel that way. We're not alone when you feel that way. I was talking to a colleague of mine who you probably know, Wendy Walsh, who does a lot of popular work around relationships. And we were talking about this, and when I was dating not long ago, and I said, I went on a few dates with this woman, and she's really lovely, but then I don't hear from her for a month. And Wendy said, what would you say if you were lecturing? I was like, oh, she's not that interested, obviously. And she's like, yeah, hello, she's not. But we don't want to hear it when we're in that same seat ourselves, right? And you're like, yeah, okay, this isn't worth my time. Do I really want to hang out with someone who gets back to me a month later?
So do you have tips then for people that are frustrated with dating, or feel exhausted, or feel like it's a full-time job and there's so many options or so many apps? Some people just want to have fun. Some people are actually looking for a long-term mate. How to do it successfully that takes care of yourself?
Oh, I love that. So I think one is, if you're on the market and you're really trying to look for, if you're single or in an open relationship, you're really trying to find a partner, I'd say go on 3 apps, go on more than one. Don't put your eggs in one basket. People use different kinds of apps. I think the trick is to be honest. Put pictures that are current. Put more than one per picture. Put a picture where we can see who you are. Long gone are the days of being bashful on these apps. Where you put an image, it's like you have a hat and you can't really see the person. Millions of people are using this apps. It's the most common way for someone to meet. It's more so in our study of singles in America, we found that over 40% of people have met their most recent date on an app or the website. Compare that to only 6% in a bar, right? People aren't meeting; they're meeting with these technologies. But if you're going to do it, go all in, go whole hog. Put the pictures on that are really you. Put pictures on that demonstrate a little bit about your personality. If you exercise a lot, show something of you on a bicycle. If you travel a lot, show a picture of you traveling. But I think being honest and genuine, we know from all of our studies that people really dislike the sense, as soon as they get a sense that you're kind of full of it, that you're dating, you're not being genuine on the courtship market, that can really negatively affect your ability. Because it's the most important advice, I think, for people is to remember that dating and courtship, it's a two-way street. It's a dance. That's why we have all these sort of metaphors about dating and dancing is that it's on both. You're putting your best foot forward, but you're also looking for someone who's putting their best foot forward. So as you're searching, someone else is searching for you. So you have to constantly remember it's this two-way interaction. You can't just ask some questions about them. You need to let them know something about you as well.
Well, and it also sounds like what you're saying is, as this develops, and maybe it's getting better, simulating what our brains looked for 50 years ago, or putting that on your app, this idea, all of these ways of assessing another person, as more information is going to be more helpful, because ultimately if you meet face to face, as you indicate, you're not going to fake it anymore. So put that, I think that's such an interesting thought. Now, wanted to ask you before we shift, and I want to talk about gender and sex and those sort of identity questions. You mentioned when we spoke before sort of some of the dangers around this online dating. Revenge porn is something people talk about. That is that there's a lot of sort of sexting or sending images to someone you might be seeing that was unheard of when I was a kid. We didn't even have this kind of technology, and then people will use it to harass or damage someone else. Can you weigh in on what your research is showing about that kind of the downsides in terms of safety?
Yeah, it's an important point, I think, that is too often overlooked, that we know that although these technologies give us these great opportunities, there's often a lot of bullying that goes on. In one of our studies, we looked at unsolicited sharing of sexual images. So people will sometimes send you an image that you didn't ask for, and the kind of classic is what's called dick pics. So men are sending images of their genitals, particularly to women. But we also often know that there's all sorts of other problems that are going on. There's a lot of sexual harassment that happens on a lot of these apps. Some of the companies have been trying to legislate that, so they've been working with state legislatures. Bumble did this in the state of Texas. They're headquartered in the state of Texas, to try and have there be penalties for people who are doing some of this kind of harassing stuff online. And a lot of the apps now will kick you off their platforms if you engage in behavior that's particularly problematic. So it's a danger. There is the sort of possibility of catfishing. That's always the case. The apps they really aren't able to do a great job of verifying who people are. So I think it's really important to meet people when possible, meet in public. Some of the apps that are more hookup apps, that are more meant for sexual encounters, they pose a different risk. And I don't mean that, I'm not sort of, if you want to have casual sex and use an app, that's great. I mean, I don't think that's inherently risky. I think the problem is if you meet someone on an app and you then meet in each other's homes, and you really don't have any context for that person. You don't know their social relationships. No one knows where you're going. That can be kind of risky. And we know that people can experience things like violent crimes or sexual assault in those cases. And not often. I mean, it's not happening at a very high rate, but it's happening at enough of a rate that one should be careful. Normally if it's a date, you say, talk for a while, first video chat or talk on the phone, meet in public, take your own car or take your own transportation. It's a little bit different if you're on an app and you've been chatting for a half hour and then plan to just go to the person's house for a sexual rendezvous.
Right. So the other topic that I wanted to switch to, which is this discussion around sex, gender, and sexual orientation or sexual identity. Could you give us some just basic definitions from a scientific standpoint of those various terms? And I just want to put a pin in the fact that I think there's a bit of a generation gap here. And I just want to, just as a disclaimer, to apologize if I'm not using the right terminology for certain people that care a lot about this issue. When I was growing up, we thought of it as bifurcated two genders. And I know you mentioned earlier some of these bifurcation around, or this idea that, okay, monogamy means monogamous personal relationships as well as sexual relationships. I think we also think of all of gender and sexual orientation as bifurcated in some way. How do you define sex, gender, sexual orientation, or whatever those proper terminologies are? And what does the science tell us about this idea that, say, there's two genders, or the Kinsey sort of scale, there's really two sexualities?
Yeah. So we break up different parts of this let's start with sex. So we often, and there's this one great article written by my colleagues Zoe Peterson and Charlene Muhlenhard that really tries to make the case for psychologists distinguishing between sex and gender, and even academics don't do a good job of this. So I think people who struggle with this, plenty of people do, including people who study sex and gender and behavior and biology, they're often not consistent in their use. So the way I use it, the way a lot of my colleagues here at the Kinsey Institute use these terms, when we refer to sex, someone's sex, we're referring to the notion of sort of being male or female. And we're often talking about their natal sex, or sometimes people will use the term biological sex. We don't use that because you can modify biology, you can modify the body. So we often talk about natal, the sort of sex assigned at birth. And there's different ways that you can define sex. The true biological way to define it is in an organism that has two or more sexes, you define male and female as female is the one with the larger gamete. So eggs are larger than sperm. And that's how we define who's female and who's male. That's kind of messy because unless you're really looking at gamete sizes, it can be difficult to sex an organism or a species. But we know that there's other things. Sometimes there's chromosomes. Sometimes there's secondary sex characteristics. So things like presence of breast, presence of penis or particular organs. And then we can sometimes do a hormonal and endocrine analysis, and the morphology, looking at body shape and size. So there's all different ways, actually, that we use several different factors in terms of determining sort of what we would call biological sex or natal sex. The gamete one is the sort of true definition a lot of biologists use.
But you're still talking two sexes. What about intersex people, or, I know some experts will say there aren't just two sexes. There are more than one sex, and which is something I'm interested in your thoughts on, because so much of our culture is around two sexes.
Yeah.
Is it a girl? Is it a boy? When you go to the hospital for your sonogram. So I wonder if you could weigh in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the classic sense, we think that there's what we call the modal distribution. So there's primarily two sexes in the case of humans, and in the case of many organisms. But it turns out that what we see is that there's variation beyond that. So although most of the population could be classified in that, Anne Fausto Sterling, who is a now retired professor at Brown University, classically wrote in her book, in her wildly influential book, Sexing the Body, that there's 5 biological sexes. And in many ways, Anne was using that as a way to try and get people to just think outside the box. She later wrote, I wasn't committed to 5 necessarily. Maybe it's 4, maybe it's 6. But the idea thinking that we do have this mode of mostly male and females, and that's part of the evolutionary story. We have to recognize the role of evolution and the existence of all organisms on this planet, and that involves mating and reproduction, which involves, in the case of humans, sort of male and female sexes and sex organs. However,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. But there's a lot of variation there. And to your point of what about intersex people? What about people? We have to acknowledge them. They're there, right? And that there's variation beyond just those two. So although there's primarily male and female in the sex sense, that we know that there are some people, there are chromosomal variations, there are intersex variations, there are people that don't neatly fit into those categories on the biological side.
Now, what about gender?
Yeah.
And how is that different from sex? And, we're people that have young, teenagers, college age students, younger people in our lives. I mean, I'm seeing more and more, people saying, listen, I'm not male or female, I'm gender non-binary.
Yeah.
Or we're coming up with new terminology, cisgender, that is living with the gender that your what do you call it, natal.
You're assigned at birth, you're natal.
Assigned at birth, yeah. Can you explain how we should think about that in a way that's scientifically accurate and helpful?
Yeah, sure. So we can think about the biological sex part, male and female. And then we can think about gender. And then when I use gender, so one thing I do and a lot of my colleagues here do is we will use terms male and female almost if we're more talking about physiology and bodies. And when we're talking about other things, we talk about gender of men and women. And so we use sort of a different set of language. And the idea for gender is, in the sort of traditional gender studies sense of what people who study this, we look at the degree to which you have masculinity and femininity. And in principle, those are orthogonal traits. So you can have, but usually you have, if you have high masculinity, you have low femininity. If you have high femininity, you have low masculinity. But there are some people who are a little bit in the middle, or there are some people that varies. Now, we often think about that overlaps with sex. Males have masculinity, females have femininity. And with that, they engage in the sort of gender role performance of men and women. But it turns out that there's a lot of variation in there as well. And for gender, there's sort of different parts of it. There's your gender performance, how feminine or masculine you perform. And then there's your gender identity, how you feel connected to that femininity and masculinity, how you feel connected to being a woman or a man. And so gender is a sort of term. We can use it to talk about men and women, or people who are beyond that, people who are non-gender binary. Maybe they don't neatly fit into men or women, or don't want to identify either one. People who are transgender, who, what's interesting about people who are transgender is that some of them still identify as a woman. So maybe you were a natal male, you were born male, and now you're a woman. So we would classify you as trans. But when we say, what's your gender? Maybe you say, my gender is a woman. You don't say, my gender is I'm a transgender person, because your gender, your performance, your identity is now as a woman. So in research, we actually, when we ask people about their gender, we ask 2 separate questions, sometimes 3 questions. If we're doing a medical type study, and the studies that we need more sort of biological clinical information, we say, what was your sex assigned at birth? What is your current gender? And do you consider yourself transgender? And so, because they become 3 different parts of that puzzle of how these things fit together.
Well, I want to push one sort of definitional question. That is, you said there's masculine traits and feminine traits. What are those? Where do those come from? Are those socially constructed, or are they scientifically, biologically constructed? And if so, what are they? Because it kind of begs the question, right?
Yeah. Oh, you brought us into the hornet's nest of where researchers disagree. People who are more kind of clinically leaning would say that they're physiological traits. And there are some traits that, you can look at literature and like studies of animals that we talk about masculine and feminine traits, has to do with androgens and testosterone, estrogens. You maybe are thinking about things like breast shape and size, penile morphology. You could talk about masculine and feminine physiological traits. But we often, when we talk about it in terms of gender performance, we often think about what a particular social context, a particular society, a particular culture, what we subscribe to that gender role. Now, in the US, that tends to be on a binary. We tend to think about men and women. There are feminine things. We think of pink. We think of dresses. There are masculine things. We think of blue. We think of working out. But that varies in cultures. And then there are many cultures who have more than one culturally recognized genders. My colleague Paul Vasey does wonderful work with the Fa'afafine of Samoa. And it's a culturally recognized third gender. They're biological and they're natal males. They perform femininity. And when you have a Fa'afafine in your family, that's just what they're called. If you say, are they men or women? You go, they're Fa'afafine. They're these biological males. They almost have the role of like a sort of a gay feminine aunt in your family. And it turns out they're important caretakers. And families that have a Fa'afafine do far better than families that don't have one. Because you have another adult, you have another caretaker in the family. They're evolutionarily significant and important. So there's a sort of interesting evolutionary story about gender beyond this binary.
Well, that was one of my questions, right? Back 4.4 million years ago, were these different variations consistent, or is this something that is socially constructed? Because some people would say, listen, young people they're just kind of need to do this and they'll grow out of it. And I'm sure that's really, really offensive to many people. Yeah. And on the other hand, I think some older people might say, well, why can't younger people respect that? It's not our comfort level to see all these different genders. I mean, how do you, first of all, what's the biological, I keep asking you compound questions, but first of all, what's the biological historical element of that as an evolutionary biologist? And secondly, do you have any thoughts on how we can start having this conversation so that both various generations can be compassionate and curious about it and not feel so defensive? Because I think that seems to happen. It's changing so fast, or why can't you understand and why can't you respect what my needs are?
Yeah, exactly. I think the degree to which we can do more research, we can have more conversations like this and elsewhere about what are these things? And people do have questions. What is the right term? What does this mean? What is that experience? That's not my experience. What is that, and I think we can come to understand the diverse experiences of people who are alive today or have been alive over the last thousands of years, and how these things vary. Many cultures have examples of third genders that are culturally recognized and sometimes play important roles in society. And sometimes there's more than three genders. So there's different ways people experience their identities, and they experience sex, they experience wanting to be man or woman, male and female, what they want with their bodies. And another piece of that is then, sexual orientation, which we could talk about in a minute.
Yes.
And that, how that then intersects with our sort of sex, gender, our bodies, that it varies quite significantly around the world. It has varied historically. But I think the part that we're getting to, and we can be compassionate, is we know people struggle with issues of their bodies and their sex and their gender and their sexual orientation. And you're so right, Kim. I mean, when we can get to a place where we can have these conversations and ask the questions and try and find scientifically evidence-based answers and be compassionate. I think about when we ask questions about trans youth, and 50% of kids who are what we call gender dysphoric or have some in the clinical sense, or who might be trans, think about suicide at some point. I mean, that's a shockingly high number. And it doesn't really matter what your background is or whether you can personally identify with it. There's not that many people out there who can genuinely say they're not concerned about such high rates of kids considering suicide. Something's wrong. Something is really wrong that that's the case. And why is it? A lot of scholars believe it has to do with the stigma that they experience, that trans youth experience. So how do we do better about that? Whether or not your opinion, one's individual opinions on being trans, we still have sort of a health crisis in that sense, that people are suffering. And pretending it's not there doesn't make it any better for anyone.
So, I mean, I think this is so fascinating to talk about it from a scientific standpoint, that it is to normalize it, to say this is consistent with the human experience. There are different genders and different cultures. I wonder if there's a way also, though, for people that are so wanting to be have their experience acknowledged and respected, and sometimes that comes into the language that we use, the pronouns that we use. There's this something called neo-pronouns that's not even in the language. It would be Z or Z or fee-fi, or people sometimes want to use the word it instead of a gender, a particular pronoun, or maybe take a third name, some other word that is just unique to them, or say, I don't want any pronouns. I want to be used I want to be called by my proper name. I think for the broader population, that can be hard. And I wonder if you have thoughts on that too, if there's ways for both sides of this conversation to meet, that is, people that are experiencing that to also have some compassion for the resistance on the other side.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think we can all learn together on these fronts. And I think that I have a colleague who is transgender woman. And one of the things that some trans women experience is during early parts of the transition, they might appear pretty masculine, right? And people will often say kind of offensive things, calling them he or they or it. And sometimes it's because people stumble. Sometimes it's because they're hateful, and there's different reasons. But what my colleague will say is that, some people, to be politically correct, in her view, they'll use they. And there's a reason that some people prefer gender-neutral pronouns. There is a politic, there is a sort of scholarship behind it. But what she says is, I went through this really difficult experience, and I'm a trans woman now. I want to be acknowledged as a woman. I want to be called her and she, not they. I want people to recognize I'm a woman now. And but sometimes people trip up because they don't know, because they're trying the gender in conversation and they're not. Are you just
not getting it right?
Are you a trans woman? Are you just a sort of feminine male, and maybe you want to be called he and him, or what are you? And that goes back to what we were saying earlier about the femininity and masculinity doesn't always totally align in our sort of identities and our performances of gender. I use the term performance because as an academic we think about gender as a performance. And so I think there's a lot of pieces there, but we do have to give people a little bit of grace to try and learn that language. But at some point, we also have to sort of get it, right? We have to sort of pay attention. The world around us is changing. The other example, I think, when you were saying earlier, is, and a really good generational one, is young people today use the word queer to describe a sort of an umbrella term for LGBTQ plus people. And a lot of older generations view that word as a slur, as a hateful slur, something maybe they were called as they were attacked or stigmatized or experienced prejudice. And we see that in some of the work we do. Sometimes that something will be put out, like it's an academic term. We'll talk about queer studies programs or queer theory. And sometimes older generations will say, why are you using that term? That's a really offensive term. But it's been reappropriated by younger generations to be something that captures a wider, sort of a bigger umbrella for these groups.
Well, I think having the patience to explain some of this stuff is goes such a long way, that someone can watch and say, okay, now I understand. So they're not tripped up, or they're not stepping in something that they don't want to get wrong, but they happen to get wrong. We're going to get kicked off in a minute. This is such a fascinating conversation. I wonder if you could just close with, one or two things that you wish more people understood about the kind of work that you do, a myth or something you'd like to dispel that comes up again and again in a popular culture or in your work, that just people should understand is misunderstood.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking me that. I think there's so many, and I think one thing that we can really think about is the reason that we study sexuality at the Kinsey Institute, why we've done it for 75 years, is of its central role in the human condition. And I think people sometimes think, oh, it's a little bit, maybe it's bizarre, or maybe it's titillating, or it's silly. But the thing that we often don't talk about is, well, the role of sort of sexuality and sexual diversity and sexual experience. We talk about divorce. People often want to talk about money. Well, you know what all the big studies say? That sex life is one of the biggest predictors of divorce. Meta-analysis after meta-analysis says that. You know what all the big studies say about cancer survivorship? That spousal support is one of the most important things. That includes people's romantic and sexual experience. When we look at things like depression, anxiety, it turns out that gender is one of the major factors in those things. So when I think about why the work we do is important, sex, gender, reproduction, is because it really is central to our lives. And I think we owe it to ourselves and people around us we can have a laugh about issues of sex and gender, but also to appreciate its significance in our well-being and our happiness and our satisfaction, and the things that our kids are experiencing, the things that we're experiencing, the highs and lows of love and heartache and health. I think we owe it to ourselves to take it seriously and to think about it with a scientific lens.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Thank you for that. And as I said, we're going to get kicked off. This is Justin Garcia, Simple Politics. You can follow us on YouTube and subscribe and watch all of these shows. But thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Learned so much, and really, really terrific.
Thanks so much for having me on. Great to be here with you.
Yay. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.